On a single morning in 1929, the richest nation on earth did not fall to bombs, armies, or famine. It collapsed because numbers stopped making sense. Screens that once promised endless prosperity suddenly turned red. Fortunes evaporated not over decades, but over hours. And what followed was not merely a stock market crash. It was something far more consequential. It was the opening act of the first global financial war. Most people are taught that the Great Depression was an accident, a tragic failure of markets, an unfortunate overreaction driven by panic. That version is comforting. It suggests no one was really in control, that history simply went wrong. But the truth is far more unsettling. The Great Depression was not just an economic collapse. It was a struggle over who would control money itself. A battle fought without soldiers or gunfire, but with interest rates, gold reserves, and policy decisions that determined who would survive and who would be sacrificed. Behind every bank failure was a choice. Behind every deflationary spiral was a doctrine. And behind every starving family stood a monetary system designed to protect stability for some, at the cost of survival for others. This was not a story of markets gone wild. It was a story of discipline enforced too late, restraint applied too brutally, and power shifting upward under the banner of responsibility. Gold did not fail by accident. It was defended until it strangled entire economies. Paper money did not rise organically. It replaced gold when political survival demanded flexibility over discipline. The Great Depression rewired the modern world not because it destroyed capitalism, but because it transformed it, from a system constrained by metal into one governed by policy, promises, and control. And once that transformation occurred, nothing about money would ever be neutral again. This is not a history lesson about the past. It is a blueprint for every crisis that followed. Because the moment money becomes a weapon, the battlefield is no longer the market. It is society itself. Before the collapse, there was belief. Absolute, contagious belief. The 1920s were not experienced as fragile or speculative. They felt inevitable. America had emerged from the First World War richer, stronger, and untouched at home. Europe was exhausted, its gold drained, its debts piling higher every year. The United States did not just lend money to the world. It became the world's banker, its factory, and its final backstop. New technologies reshaped daily life. Automobiles turned cities outward. Radios collapsed distance. Skyscrapers climbed higher as if growth itself had become a law of nature. Productivity surged. Corporate profits followed. And Wall Street transformed from a national exchange into the financial heartbeat of the planet. This was not greed in the crude sense. It was confidence institutionalized. Credit was cheap, plentiful, and normalized. Banks encouraged ordinary people to participate in markets once reserved for elites. Buying stocks on margin became routine. For every dollar owned, 9 could be borrowed. Leverage stopped feeling like risk and started feeling like opportunity. The Federal Reserve, barely a decade old, stood at the center of this transformation. Created to stabilize crises, it instead amplified optimism. Rates stayed low. Liquidity flowed. Speculation was not restrained because it looked like progress. Newspapers celebrated rising indexes as proof of national destiny. Politicians pointed to markets as validation of policy. Households tied their future security not to wages or savings, but to asset prices that only seemed to move in one direction. But prosperity built on debt is not prosperity. It is acceleration without brakes. The illusion was not that growth existed. Growth was real. The illusion was that it was permanent. That leverage could expand indefinitely without consequence. That confidence itself had replaced discipline. Underneath the music, beneath the champagne, the system was quietly becoming brittle. Small shocks could now trigger outsized consequences. When confidence cracked, leverage would magnify the damage. And when belief failed, it would fail everywhere at once. The crash did not create the Great Depression. It merely revealed how fragile the miracle had always been. When the market collapsed, the damage was still containable. Wealth had vanished, confidence was shaken, but the economy itself was not yet destroyed. What followed was not inevitable. It was engineered through fear, doctrine, and a deep misunderstanding of what money actually is. After the crash, the Federal Reserve faced a defining decision. It could flood the system with liquidity, stabilize banks, and prevent a contraction of credit, or it could defend the dollar at all costs, even if that meant sacrificing growth, employment, and trust. It chose discipline. At the time, the world was still chained to the gold standard. Every dollar in circulation was tied to a fixed quantity of gold. If too much money was created, foreign holders could demand redemption. Gold would leave the country. The currency would weaken. Confidence would shatter. To policymakers, this was the ultimate nightmare. Sound money was not just an economic principle, it was a moral one. So instead of easing, the Federal Reserve tightened. Interest rates rose. Liquidity dried up. Credit contracted precisely when the system needed oxygen. Banks, already weakened by falling asset values, began to fail. Depositors rushed to withdraw savings. One failure triggered another. Between 1930 and 1933, nearly 10,000 American banks collapsed. Entire communities lost their financial backbone overnight. This was no longer a market crash. It was a monetary implosion. As banks disappeared, money itself became scarce. Prices fell. Wages followed. Debts, fixed in nominal terms, grew heavier with every passing month. The real burden of borrowing exploded, not because people had borrowed more, but because the value of money itself was rising. Deflation rewarded those who held cash and punished those who worked, produced, or owed. It transferred wealth upward, silently and relentlessly. The policy was justified as necessary pain. Short-term suffering for long-term stability. But stability never arrived. The contraction fed on itself. Falling prices reduced demand. Reduced demand destroyed jobs. Lost jobs caused defaults. Defaults broke banks. What began as a financial correction had become a full-scale collapse of trust. Money, once designed to facilitate exchange, had turned into a weapon against the very economy it was meant to serve. The gold standard had once been celebrated as the pinnacle of monetary civilization. It promised stability, discipline, and trust across borders. Currencies were fixed. Exchange rates were predictable. Governments could not print their way out of trouble. In theory, this restraint prevented excess and preserved confidence. In practice, it became a trap. Under gold, monetary policy was not about domestic survival. It was about defending reserves. If gold flowed out of a country, the response was automatic and brutal. Interest rates had to rise. Government spending had to be cut. Wages had to fall. Pain was not a side effect. It was the mechanism. This system might have worked in a world of balanced trade and flexible societies, but the post-war world was nothing like that. Europe was indebted. The United States held the majority of global gold. Capital flows were unstable, and when crisis struck, every country was forced to apply the same deflationary medicine at the same time. Instead of isolating failure, gold synchronized it. As banks failed and prices collapsed, governments tightened further to defend their currencies. Domestic economies were sacrificed to protect international credibility. Gold sat idle in vaults while factories closed and unemployment soared. In Britain, joblessness surged past 20%. In Germany, deflation crushed the middle class already scarred by hyperinflation a decade earlier. In the United States, production collapsed even as gold reserves grew. The system could not adapt. Every country was chained to the same sinking ship. Leaving gold meant breaking faith with creditors and risking capital flight. Staying on gold meant prolonged depression. What had once been a symbol of trust became a noose. The tragedy was not that policymakers were cruel. It was that they were trapped by doctrine. Gold was treated not as a tool, but as a moral absolute. Defending it became more important than defending society. And so, the world endured years of unnecessary suffering, not because there was no alternative, but because abandoning gold required admitting that the system itself was flawed. The Great Depression was no longer national. It was global, synchronized, and self-reinforcing. The first crack in the gold system did not come from revolution or ideology. It came from exhaustion. By 1931, Britain was bleeding gold. Investors no longer believed the pound could be defended at its fixed parity. Capital fled. Reserves drained from the Bank of England. The government responded exactly as doctrine demanded. Wages were cut. Public spending was slashed. Interest rates were raised. Nothing worked. The harder Britain tried to defend gold, the faster gold left. The economy shrank. Unemployment deepened. Social stability began to fracture. What had once been the anchor of the global financial system was now suffocating under its own restraint. In September of that year, Britain did what had been unthinkable for more than a century. It abandoned the gold standard. Overnight, the pound fell by roughly 30%. Commentators declared disaster. For generations, the pound had been treated as synonymous with stability. Its departure from gold was seen as a betrayal of financial civilization itself. But something unexpected happened. Exports became competitive. Credit conditions eased. Production stabilized. Within months, Britain began to recover. Not because confidence magically returned, but because the economy was finally allowed to breathe. The lesson was stark. Gold had not been protecting Britain. It had been imprisoning it. Other countries noticed. Those that followed Britain off gold earlier tended to recover faster. Those that clung to it suffered longer and deeper contractions. The evidence was visible, but the courage to act was scarce. Leaving gold meant admitting that discipline had become destructive. It meant accepting inflation as the price of survival, and it meant confronting the political consequences of devaluation. Many governments hesitated. Some could not move at all. The gold standard was breaking, not because it failed to enforce rules, but because it enforced them too well. And while Britain stepped away from the altar, the United States remained kneeling. While Britain stepped away from gold, the United States clung to it with near religious conviction. To American leaders, sound money was not merely policy, it was virtue. Abandoning gold was equated with weakness, irresponsibility, and national decline. President Herbert Hoover embodied this belief. He insisted that maintaining the dollar's gold value was a moral obligation. Markets would correct, confidence would return. Pain, however severe, was temporary and necessary. But the pain was neither temporary nor abstract. As the United States defended gold, deflation tightened its grip. Prices fell by roughly 1/3. Each dollar gained purchasing power, but wages disappeared. Farmers found it cheaper to destroy food than to sell it. Milk was poured into ditches. Crops were left to rot. Not because people did not need them, but because money had become too scarce to move goods through the system. Unemployment surged into the millions. Bread lines stretched through every major city. Families who had saved responsibly lost everything when banks collapsed. The currency remained strong. Society weakened. The paradox was brutal. The stronger the dollar became, the more Americans suffered. Debt became unbearable. Loans fixed in nominal terms grew heavier as incomes fell. Defaults spread. Banks failed. Each failure deepened the contraction. The system was locked in a downward spiral, driven not by greed, but by restraint. Gold was defended. People were not. By 1933, the country was at a breaking point. Confidence in markets had evaporated. Confidence in institutions was close behind. What remained was fear and a growing willingness to accept radical solutions. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office, the economic crisis had already become a political emergency. Stability was no longer about preserving rules. It was about preserving order. And that required a revolution in money. Franklin Delano Roosevelt did not begin his presidency by promising growth. He began by seizing control. Within days of taking office in 1933, he declared a nationwide bank holiday. The entire financial system froze. Deposits were locked. Withdrawals stopped. Panic was contained not by reassurance, but by authority. Then came the most radical monetary action in American history. Private ownership of gold was outlawed. Citizens were ordered to surrender their coins and bullion to the government at a fixed price. Those who complied were paid. Those who resisted faced criminal penalties. Months later, the government revalued gold dramatically higher, devaluing the dollar overnight. The result was immediate. Prices rose. Debt burdens eased. The economy began to stabilize. But something else happened as well. Wealth shifted upward and inward, from citizens to the state, from savers to policymakers. Inflation replaced deflation, and control replaced discipline. What gold had once restricted, paper money now enabled. Other nations followed. Competitive devaluations spread across the globe. Currencies were weakened intentionally to survive. Trade fractured. Global cooperation collapsed. Economic warfare replaced financial order. Out of this chaos emerged a new system. One where governments no longer answered to gold, but to themselves. After the Second World War, that system was formalized. The dollar sat at the center. Gold was pushed into vaults. Trust was replaced by management. Most people remember the Great Depression as a tragedy. It was. But it was also a transfer of power. Money ceased to be a neutral measure and became a political instrument. Every crisis since has followed this template. Print, stabilize, centralize. The language changes. The logic does not. The Great Depression was not the end of capitalism. It was its transformation. And once money became a tool of power, every future crisis became a choice. If this perspective helped you see modern finance differently, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Understanding how money shapes power is the first step toward protecting what you own.